There were over 150 people came. We know that anything that's got to do with the history of the North River or shipbuilding brings out everybody, and it was a perfect night, no storms, and everybody came out.
Without any further delay, help me give a warm welcome to Kayla.
Thank you. I did grow up on the river, and it was a big part of my childhood to be able to have this wonderful place to enjoy, to play, to enjoy the natural beauty of it. And ever since I was a child, just digging around in the muck along the banks of the river and finding little bits of pottery, broken pieces of probably old whiskey bottles, and whatever was left over from times past. I remember one little specific piece that kind of stuck in my head because it was a thing that sent me for a loop as a child. I used to find these little wooden pegs in the river, and I wouldn't have thought that they were something of significant age at the time. But I took them out. They were small. They were purposely built. They weren't just a stick or something. I could see they were cut, and I'd take them out and I'd put them in a place to dry. And I'd come back the next day and be gone, and I always wondered who's stealing my wooden pegs I spent all this time caring for. Oh, sure. So I did find out later that they weren't being stolen. They were disintegrating because they were about 150 years old and were preserved in the muck of the river. So once I took them out, back to nature they went. Recently, we've discovered a lot more artifacts. We've learned how to take care of them a little bit better, so we've been able to preserve them well. And there's some great stories behind them as well. And we've read up a lot of stories, a lot of that research that we've done, myself, my family, and I've been lucky enough to be part of a group that has come together from the shipbuilding towns along the North River. So not only Hanover, but Norwell, Scituate, Marshfield, and Pembroke all have shipbuilding along the North River as a significant part of their history. And I built up a wonderful network of local historians, and we've been working together, talking about the different stories from these days, talking about the shipyards that have the markers on them. So there are 10 shipyards that are marked along the North River, and they were put up in 1919. So this year is the 100th year anniversary of the installation of those historical markers. Some of the people that are part of this group are here tonight. We have Janet Watson from Norwell, my friend Paul McCarthy from Marshfield, Stephen Litchfield from Scituate, and maybe a couple other folks here that I haven't noticed yet. But it's really been a great group to work with, and we've discovered a lot of really amazing stories so far. So to get on with this presentation, oh boy. All right. I put here this little map. I wanted to start talking about the shipyards that were along the upper river. So this is pretty far upriver right here. This is the old stone bridge that crosses between Hanover and Pembroke. It's on, so this is Washington Street here. There's been a bridge here since about 1656. This little section here you can see is a pretty dense area where we had 11 shipyards on the Hanover side and a couple on the Pembroke side as well. And going downriver just a little bit further, this way brings you to the ocean as you go across the page here. We had the Brick Kiln Shipyard further down on the Pembroke side and Fox Hill over on the Norwell side, which was then Scituate. So in about 1690, we had shipbuilding in the Fox Hill area. Back in the mid-1600s, Pembroke was part of Duxbury. There's a bunch of records of shipbuilding happening in Duxbury. It doesn't tell us if that was on the shores of the North River or if it was over in the harbor in Duxbury, but we did know we most likely had some activity down there as well. As the further we come upriver, we have this area here, which was, we know shipbuilding began in this part of Hanover in around the 1660s. So this little section of river right here, this 8th mile section between the bridge and the North River, we had about 11 shipyards in operation over the course of history, and another 2 that were within about another mile of the Third Herring Brook. So to give you a little bit of idea, I don't want to bore you too much with the numbers, but we had about 360 vessels built in that little section of the North River. Now that's what we have record of. A lot of the records were lost after the Revolutionary War when the British evacuated Boston. They brought a lot of the shipping records with them, so they're most likely more than that. But this is what was been able to scrape together from local records. A lot of what we have just comes from Briggs' History of Shipbuilding on the North River. It's an excellent book and has a lot of information in it. We found a few tidbits from other sources as well that we've kind of added to our database, but most of what we find here is from that book. So going back to this slide one more time, so the density of shipbuilding in this area, it's more dense than any other area on the river. And especially in the late 1700s, early 1800s, with all the shipbuilding activity, if you were standing on this bridge and looking downriver, you'd see at least up to 5 ships on the ways being built at any given time. And the men that went into that, so at least they say it would take about 200 men to build a ship over the course of its construction. Not all at one time for one ship, but the different specialized laborers that would be there would add up to about 200 people. So with 5 different ships all working at the same time, you can imagine this would be an absolute bustling with activity at the time. Hundreds of individuals, the din of the hammer, the other noise that went on with the blacksmith shop nearby, and everything that was happening there. It was quite a busy spot. Now it's a quiet little bedroom community, and it's hard to think about how in the past this area was so much more active than we've ever known it in more modern times. So getting a little bit more down now, I wanted to kind of focus on the shipbuilding in Hanover, and particularly Barstow's Two Oaks. This is the shipyard that I've collected the most information on so far for a couple of reasons. The land that I currently own on the North River is the location of the Barstow's Two Oaks shipyard. And we've done quite a bit of research on it as well. After we acquired this land, my wife and my mother put together a special birthday present for me, which was a historical, designating this land as a historical place. And they put together all the paperwork and collected a huge amount of information on it about some of the ships that were built there, just about how this area impacted the industry at the time. And that's kind of what I've rolled into a lot of this presentation, just some of the other information we've been collecting as well. What we have also got put together, there's a collection of paintings, photographs that we have images of course, the artifacts that we have on display here, and several stories that we've dug up in recent times. So this is just a quick list to give you an idea how many ships were built just at Barstow's Two Oaks. And really this record only kind of is for post-Revolutionary War. So there's one ship, the Grand Turk, that was built during the Revolutionary War. There wasn't much activity going on during wartime periods, both in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Just focus was elsewhere other than merchant and fishing vessels, which were the primary vessel built along the river. But you can see how we kind of have a couple big nodes of shipbuilding in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Shipbuilding pretty much died out in the upper river, especially in the mid-1800s, before the mid-1800s. There was some activity further downriver, but that was the end of it there. And this also gives you an idea of the timeline and the size of the ships that were built. So the number that is listed here, that was the tonnage, that kind of gives us an idea of the size of the ship. So 300 tons, 77 tons. This isn't the weight of the vessel. That wouldn't have been a thing that they would have had an ability to measure back then. What it is it's kind of a measure of the amount of cargo that these vessels could hold. So whatever the purpose of it was built, this is the way that they kind of describe the size of the vessel. So there was the interior cubic footage of it was really translated into a tonnage amount. So that's what that means. It gives you a rough idea of the size of the vessel, but some ships would have been built longer and faster, but had a lower amount of tonnage or whatnot. So that gives us kind of an idea of what we expect for the size of these vessels. But given that, a 300-ton vessel or so probably would have been over 100 feet long. And that's a ship that would have been launched in our little North River, 15 miles from the mouth of the river at the time, and navigated all the way downstream to the mouth and out to the ocean. Getting over the bar was like the last tricky part of that process. I don't know if anyone's taken any of the pontoon boat tours or done just a kayak ride along the river, but it's hard to imagine just getting down the river with a moderate-sized boat, what it was like to bring a large craft down with the technology of the time. So I'd like to show some of the historical images that we've been collecting. This is a very well photographed scene right here, the old North River Bridge. So this is the most recent North River Bridge. This one was built in the early 1900s. It's a beautiful structure. I get to look at this just about every day, and it's always a delight seeing the water reflecting off the water and giving that kind of circular tunnel look is just magnificent. It wasn't always such a a beautiful structure, but it's always been functional. This was the first crossing at the North River that was built. There were places where you could ford the stream further upriver, but then it wasn't the North River anymore. You got to the Indian Head River and other smaller streams along the way. If you went downriver from here, there was nowhere to cross the river other than a ferry. So you could pay a ferryman to take you across. If you had a large team of horses or whatnot, this was the place to go. And it was said about 15 miles to the mouth of the river, although really only about 7 miles as the crow flies from the coast. So this was a pretty popular, pretty busy road. This was the Plymouth-Boston road that would bring a lot of traffic back and forth. And also kind of a crossroads, and I think what helped this become such a busy place for shipbuilding, it was a pretty busy crossroads at the time. It was easy to get goods in and out of there, to bring some of the materials in for shipbuilding and whatnot. This map right here can be found in the Briggs Shipyard, Briggs History of Shipbuilding on the North River book. And this is kind of one of my favorites. I've spent a lot of time staring at this, and it doesn't look like much, but when I walk along the land and kind of imagine what the different landmarks that are still in place there and what that translated to, what that was a sign of, that we can see in this map. And some things are just hard to pick out, but we see this area right here. This is Turner's Wharf in Pembroke, and we can still see some evidence of that today. Where this wharf was here in Hanover, we can still get an idea of where that promontory was, where there's still a bunch of stones there, and we can tell that was a man-made structure and a significant part of the banks of the river at the time. And this is a fun thing that my wife and I put together, is we took this historical image and overlaid it onto a Google Maps image, and use this to kind of get an idea of where some of these things lay. When we had a couple points, we have the mouth of the Third Herring Brook up here, and we have the bridge, and we have a couple features that we can see in the land, and we're able to line the whole thing up, and that gave us a pretty good idea of where all these shipyards lay along the river. The Barstow's Two Oaks yard that I'm going to get back to in a moment was right around here, but we also had all these other yards. We had the Turner Palmer Magoon yard that was shown kind of right at the old bridge. We have Wing and Kingman yard that are downriver a little closer to the Pembroke, to the Third Herring Brook, and a lot in between. And this piece right here is what another photograph, and then I have another image of it here as well as a painting that's on display at the Stetson House in Hanover. So this is the Rainbow Bridge, which crossed over the Third Herring Brook. And to go back again, it's referenced here as a crossing over the Third Herring Brook, close to the mouth. This was the main way to get across Third Herring Brook by foot for all the workers that were going back and forth from the shipyards here and also to the other shipyards further downriver. Most of the people probably lived in Scituate. In the beginning of the 1700s and even up to the mid-1700s, Hanover was kind of a backwater. It wasn't a very well-populated place compared to towns like Scituate and other coastal areas. It was more of a farming community and starting to build up some industry. So a lot of the workers most likely came from Scituate and other places further downriver. And this was the main point of crossing, the Rainbow Bridge, which we've heard written about quite a few times. This crossing is just off of Old Bridge Road in Hanover. Now, it would be hard to find. I've never really nailed down the exact location of it, or my neighbor Peter Tyak could probably give me a pretty good idea where he thinks it would be located. But this was there for probably the better part of 100 years, and until the early 1900s when it was taken out in a storm and never rebuilt. But it has this interesting rainbow feature, which actually isn't really structural in any way. The structure is really this component here that's helping to hold up the bridge. The rainbow curved part of it, I think, is most likely a bit of flair added by the shipbuilders. They probably had a lot to do with building this bridge, and they were using curved pieces of wood to build every other component of the ship, so why not make a bridge fancy? This is another photograph that I get pretty excited about. When I stumbled across this one, which I found on an online source, I'm still trying to chase down the owner of these photographs because I wonder how many more are in different collections that have yet to be seen in public too much. But these two red circles here are the Barstow's Two Oaks and the Smith's later Lower Barstow shipyard markers. And if you look closely, we can see there is kind of the a white line and then a dark sign on it that has the post on the back of the cast iron sign. And those are the locations where they originally were. This one here was moved when the cul-de-sac was put in here in the 1960s, but the other one is still in its place, the Barstow's Two Oaks sign. This stone wall, we still see evidence of this, although a cul-de-sac was put in here and it was broken up a little bit. And this building here I'm well familiar with. Was converted into a residence in 1959, and it's where I reside with my family currently. So finding this picture was quite a treat for me to stumble across this. The stone wall here, this particular one doesn't exist, but we have these stone walls running through our neighborhoods, these old English-style squared-off stone walls that were once part of the industry, of the farmland that was there. Now, the Stockbridge family was the family that owned this land during most of the shipbuilding years. And they weren't shipbuilders themselves. They were farmers, they owned the farmland, but they leased the land to the shipbuilders. All those 11 shipyards that we saw along the Hanover banks were on lease. So people would come down there, they'd build their ships, they could probably use some of the local resources, but they were paying rent based on the tonnage of the vessels that they were building there, which is a pretty interesting way to do it. So, you know, slow years where they weren't building anything, I don't think they had to do much, but when they were doing well and building some large vessels, that's how they compensated the local farmer. This is an image of pretty much the same spot, but from a different angle, kind of from the other side. And this is obviously much later than the shipbuilding days. This is probably in the early 1900s. I'm not sure if the shipyard markers are just out of view in this picture, or if this was built. This was taken prior to 1919 when they were installed. But we see the boathouse here, most likely a close approximation of where the workhouse for the shipyard may have once been located. Just pleasure boats along the banks now and moored along the river. But we can see a little bit of evidence here. This large rock will come up in some of the slides further down, and was probably part of the Turner's Wharf that was most likely a stopping point for some of the boats that would be coming upriver, and probably where they'd be tying up the ships just after launching and before they would send them on their way downriver. This is also a pretty exciting part. Some of you may have seen some of these paintings before. They're the Mac Ivor Reddy collection, and this series of paintings are actually on the dining room walls. They're murals painted on the dining room walls on a home in Four Corners in Hanover. This series was painted probably in the 1930s or so, so they weren't a first-person perspective of the shipyards, but the artists most likely spent some time researching and some time down at the river sketching the landscape and getting an idea of how he would paint his interpretation of what he thought the shipyards were at the time. In the 1930s, there was probably still some visible evidence of the shipyards there, but there was some significant change in the river in 1898 when the Portland Gale opened up the new inlet to the North River, which is between 3rd and 4th Cliff now. The old inlet to the North River, the old mouth, was about 3 miles down up the South River, where Wrexham Beach currently is now. When that change happened, we saw a lot of a significant change in the tidal influences upriver, even this far. Changes in salinity of the water, deeper higher high tides, more extreme low tides and whatnot. And that changed the landscape quite a bit. Just a couple of decades of that extra flooding turned dry land into marshland and different things like this. But there was most likely still some evidence, still at that time, some that we've seen written about before. So with this collection of photographs, this is most likely the collecting of timbers for the shipyards, which a lot of that probably did happen in the winter season when they wouldn't be building. And it was probably a bit easier to drag trees out of the woods when it's covered in the snow. When you don't have a road and you were relying on oxen pulling carts, having a nice blanket of snow that maybe was packed down a little bit was probably a great way of hauling things out. So we usually typically assume that a lot of the harvesting of timber was done in the winter months. This is the blacksmith's forge. Now, I've never, I don't think there was typically a forge located along near the shipyards, like right on the river, but I don't believe this would have been one of them. They're typically pretty small operations. I've heard this to be described as an anchor forge as well. You can see there are a couple anchors and some other hoops for wagon wheels and whatnot. So this is probably kind of a general purpose blacksmith shop and not located right at the shipyard proper, but perhaps one that was located, we know there was a blacksmith shop of significance right in Four Corners. I don't see any matching features in the landscape that would really tell me it's Four Corners, but that may have been the artist's idea when he was painting this. And this is where it really gets into the most exciting part for me and kind of the meat and potatoes of these paintings. When I saw these, I really got excited. Now, I recently had the opportunity to get in there and get a first-hand look at them, and Abbey Knoll Photography, Maura Longeal from Abbey Knoll Photography, was kind of to come in and take some excellent photographs of them. So we have these high-quality photographs we had now. The older photographs that I'd seen before had a lot of shadowing and not a lot of the detail was able to be picked up. So this has been really a great experience to be able to kind of dig into this. And I spent a lot of time down at the river looking at this scene and looking out at the landscape as it is today and picking out some of the features. So a few slides back, I showed you can kind of see this big old boulder that was in one of the photographs. And I believe that is this same boulder right here that is on this feature, which is most likely Turner's Wharf. And the two ways right here of the Barstow's Two Oaks, if we looked at the map, we see one is at a kind of a steep angle to the bank and one is more or less perpendicular, which is kind of what we see with the two sets of ways here. And again, this is the perspective that I look at when I go down to the river and I see, of course, they both just look like the bank of a river, but picking out some of the key features, the rock formations here that have the steel eye bolts sticking out of them. And it's a little difficult to see on even on this slide down on the bottom here, we have one of these steel eye bolts still in place. There was another one that was there years ago that had broken away, but some other little tidbits and evidence of these shipyards that we can still find when we dig in a little bit. And the beautiful ship on the ways, in my eyes, quite beautiful to see a magnificent piece of woodwork, like a wooden vessel being built, now replaced by my ugly tin boat, but it still gets some use for the purpose of recreation anyhow. And the last painting in this series is the launching of the ship on the ways. Now, I've done a bit of digging and I've come up dry so far in trying to identify what this vessel is. I don't know if the artist had a particular vessel in mind when they were doing the paintings. But in this next slide, we can see that when they produced this painting, they used the launching of the Helen Foster as a subject to help get an idea. Whereas, and you can see these almost look like they're the same painting, the same image. But a little closer examination kind of shows, well, this view here of the Helen Foster, which was the only photograph of a ship ever being built on the North River that I'm aware of. There could be something else hidden out there, but the heyday of shipbuilding was going as photography was in its infancy. But we do see this photograph quite often of the Helen Foster being launched on the banks of the North River and what was then Scituate. We have the wide marshlands bordering the river in this image, and we have the steep banks on this side. And we have a lot of features in common, the women in dress, the picket fence, but even some features, when we look closely, we see quite different on the vessel. This would have been a vessel typical of the Barstow's Two Oaks and the upriver shipyards built in the late 70s shipping, and they were rarely enormous vessels. So at this period in our history, the 1700s, 1800s, these were big vessels for the time, but still able to fit down the North River upon their launching. Now, after the ship was launched, that's when a different set of hard work came into play. So the ship was built, it was sent on its way, and now it had to get 15 miles downriver to the mouth. Now, depending on the size of the vessel, some would have been rigged in this place. They would have had masts. If it was a smaller sloop or schooner, it could have been rigged with sails and sailed out. But most of the larger vessels were taken out by one of at least three different very manual methods. One would have been using a pulling boat, a rowboat manned by 8 or 10 men, just rowing and using their backs to pull that boat all the way out of the river. Most likely just working on an outgoing tide shortly after the high tide, so you had enough water and you had the current pulling you out. The other method would have been to have a couple guys in a boat pull out the kedge anchor, which was an anchor designed really just to kind of dig in the muck and hold a horizontal force, but be able to be pulled vertically up out of the mud pretty easily. They dropped that anchor and used the capstan of the ship, which is the manual powered winch towards the front, using to pull up the anchor when the ship is weighing anchor. And they would use this to pull the ship along the river bit by bit. So hauling out that cable as far as they could, dropping the anchor and wheeling it in. That would be another method. Probably the most common method used was be a team of oxen on each side of the river pulling those ships downriver as they could, bit by bit. I mean, that's at least you have the animals doing the work in that case and not your back, and requiring a couple men to man each team of oxen and a couple men on board to manage the ship. And this is the last photograph, the last painting in that series, and this is the ship at sea, most likely that same one that was being launched and built on the ways. So I wish I knew the name of the vessel. I had some inkling, but this is certainly very typical of the ships built at that era, and that may have been an idea, more of a good idea of what we saw a lot of back in that day during the heyday of shipbuilding on Barstow's Two Oaks and the other shipyards along the North River in Hanover. So now I'd like to get a little bit about the artifacts that we found. So these are the very exciting, more recent discoveries that we've made, and I have all of the items we found recently up here on display. Shortly after we purchased this land, my father decided it'd be a fun idea to go buy a metal detector, and so he did. And I didn't really think much of it at the time, and he went out his first day, and the thing was just beeping like crazy all over there. I mean, you couldn't walk 10 feet without something going off. And in short order, we had a large pile of small artifacts. Now, we found lots of metal spikes, which would have been a very common piece used for fastening the upper works of the ship. You wouldn't be using iron spikes below the waterline for the obvious reason they would rust, and you wouldn't be able to get to it easily to put a coat of paint on or anything like that. But a lot of the topsides fastenings would have been made out of iron. And the method of attaching them would have been these iron spikes. So we found loads of these. We found some other small tools. And one of the prizes of our collection was this piece here. So that was I remember I was away for a weekend with my family, and I got a call from my dad asking when I'm going to be back. He knew when I was going to be back. He's just excited about me getting home so we could finish uncovering this artifact and try to figure out what it was. Of course, there's all kinds of speculation at first. Was it we knew it was a thin metal object. Was it the cover to a treasure chest? Was it a king's ransom in gold hidden in our land? And I doubted that anyway, but once I saw it, I did get really excited because I knew exactly what it was. And I was very excited about this artifact for a couple of reasons. One, it's a huge artifact. I mean, finding an old saw. So this is a 7-foot-long pit saw that we see displayed over here next to the speaker. This is what would have been used for cutting a lot of the larger timbers in place at the shipyard. And another reason I was really excited about, not just the fact of finding this, but it told us a lot about the shipyard as well. So Barstow's Two Oaks Shipyard was named, its namesake was two grand oak trees that were, for some reason, never cut down for shipbuilding and were still part of the shipyard and located probably within 100 feet of the bank. Now, these oak trees are also kind of a functional part of the shipyard, as they were used to build scaffolding for the pit saw. Now, pit saw is called a pit saw because it's usually used in a pit. And I believe I have an image of it here. Of a pit where you could put your log across it. You'd have a guy on top that'd be pulling the saw up. That guy was the sawyer. He was the master craftsman. He had the job of following whatever profile they wanted to cut, either a straight piece or maybe a curve for one of the ribs of the ship or whatever that they were building. That was his job, and also to put the kerfs in, just little pieces of wedges of wood to keep the wood from closing back in and pinching the saw and making the job more difficult. Now, the guy on the bottom was the laborer. He had the lesser skilled job of just pulling down the saw and keeping the work going. The cut was made as the saw was pulled down. It was only brought up to really retract, and the sawyer was only pulling that up so it could be drawn down once again. So the guy on the bottom had the job of doing all the work, pulling that saw down and getting a face full of sawdust every time he came down to further the cut. The Barstow's Two Oaks shipyard had not a pit, but scaffolding set up. There may have been some excavation for it, but most of it was above ground. And the grand two oak trees that were there were used as part of the scaffolding for the saw pit. So it was something we kind of had speculated. Where were the two oak trees? We see them on some maps, but no other reference that would help us nail it down. And once we found this saw, we knew it probably wasn't exactly there, but it must have been close by, because I can't imagine that the saw would have been stored too far from where they were actually using it. The workhouse that would have been there was probably used to store a lot of the tools. Well, the shipyards were in use, but with a structure like the scaffolding for the saw pit, the saw was most likely stored on site. So this kind of gave us a good idea of where not only the saw pit was, but also most likely these 2 grand oak trees that were the namesake for the shipyard. So here's another picture of it as it appeared in the dirt before we hauled it out. It was, of course, very delicate. It had been lying in the dirt for well over a century and a half at that point, and still in pretty good shape considering, but not something we wanted to flop around too much. So we've kept it supported, and now we've built a case for it for storing it since. The other tools that we found quite a bit of are an iron drift, which this would be kind of a pin, and when they were putting together these different pieces of the ship, the ribs in the side, the prow for the bow, and the stern post, or all these different components. It wasn't like we do it these days. You didn't have someone with a drill gun with a pocket full of bolts from Home Depot that they were just going to drive into the thing. Everything had to get lined up perfectly. The hole was drilled, and then you needed to hold it in place while it was fastened, and that's what these iron drifts were used for. So we have a couple of these large metal pins, iron pins, that would have been put in place. Some of them may have been left in place. I think some of them also were removed, and after a couple other fastenings were put in place, most likely wooden pegs, and another piece of wood would be put in its place. So it was sometimes a building material, sometimes a tool. Another couple of tools we have are the reamer, and this is the hawsing chisel. So these were used for the process of caulking the ships, which was a big component of the shipbuilding. So as the ship was being built, we'd put on the ribs, we'd have the whole frame of the ship going up, and the planking would be the next part. So after all the custom work was done, after all these pieces were hand hewn in place and steam bent to fit the perfect contour of that ship, then the planking could be put on. Now the planking was just strips of lumber that mostly came from the local sawmills. They could be the standard length of 12 or 14 feet and the standard thickness and the standard size that most of the planking was. So they didn't have to saw that stuff by hand. And that was all attached using these wooden trunnels or wooden pegs that we found some of. But the next step after that was to sealing the ship up, the caulking of this vessel. So to put a ship together and to have it all fit just right, you had to think about how when this wooden boat was placed in the water, all the wood's going to absorb water and everything's going to expand. So gaps had to be left between each one of these planks. And this is where the caulking was driven. So it was kind of a natural-made gasket material, kind of a fibrous hemp or oakum or other material that was driven into the caulking seams between each one of these planks. And that did 2 things. It helped seal up and reduce some of the water infiltration that happened to the bilges of the ship before these planks fully swelled and closed all those gaps. And once they did close, it actually helped act as a gasket as well to keep a nice good seal between these planks. And a well-built ship, despite being just made without wood, without any of the silicon caulking or other materials that we have today, could be sealed up pretty well and hardly leak a drop if built properly. And that was really an amazing feat for the time. And these are the tools that were used to do it, the caulking tools that were quite prominent during the shipbuilding era. We also have a chisel here, not too different from the typical wood chisel that someone would have in their woodworking toolbox today, and some other more specialized tool. This is I believe it's called a chisel axe. This is a typical hammerhead, a little wedge here, and some other pieces that may have been from the shipyards, maybe not, but we threw them in the pile and we hope to identify them down the road. And this is kind of an idea of what was going on with the caulking. Men with these wooden mallets that were driving in the caulking hour after hour, day after day, and that din of the caulking hammer would have been a pretty common sound to hear along the banks of the river during these days. Here are a little bit of the rest of our tools here, the rest of our find. Close-up of the spikes, so the metal spikes, and this probably aren't even half of them. We found pounds and pounds of them to give you an idea of how prolific these components were. And these were just the ones that lasted, that stood time. I can imagine probably 10 times this number in wooden pegs that could have been found if they weren't rotted away so quickly over the ages. The last piece, the artifact that I'd like to talk about, is this one that we love to call the Iron Pig. This one threw us a loop for quite some time. We dug this one up and immediately noticed that there's some raised lettering on it. And it seems to us to say Barstow. But why would there be this 50-pound bar of metal with the name Barstow on it? We know it's Barstow's Two Oaks and there's Barstow's Lower Yard. They're a prominent family, but why would they stick their name on a 50-pound bar of iron? It doesn't seem like something you could display to have as a nameplate for your shipyard or anything. It was unwieldy. It was immense. And we talked to quite a few experts we thought might have an answer for us, and came up pretty dry until we met a man named Ray Larson, who lives in Hanover, over near Mayette Store, if you know where that is. It's right along the Indian Head River. And his home is right on the corner there. When he saw this, he knew exactly what it was. Now, Ray is he's a blacksmith. He was a tool maker as his career, and in retirement, he loves just making metal pieces. So he's making iron the old-fashioned way. He's heating things up, he's smashing it with a hammer, and he's building all kinds of things. He knows this process, he knows metalworking, and he knows history of it too, and was able to tell me exactly what this is. This was a piece of iron that would be used as feedstock for the local forges that would have been right at the shipyard. Now, we know that there were some small forges located right along the shipyards, because as they built the ships and needed the iron fittings for the top sides of the ship, this wasn't a piece that you could even custom order from a local blacksmith shop and have it deliver them next week. You know, it certainly wasn't something you could get off the shelf. These had to be built and fit in place to fit exactly where you wanted it on the ship. Everything was wood, it was cut to fit, and so were the iron pieces as well. So you needed a blacksmith on hand to build these different fittings for the ship. And this is what we needed the forge for, and the forge needed something as a material to build these out of. So the blacksmith would grab a piece of this iron, check it off with a hack, which wasn't a hacksaw like we have today. It was a heavy chisel that they would heat up the iron bar and actually be able to smash through it and bite off a chunk of it and make their iron fittings for the top sides of the ship. And the reason this has the word Barstow in it, because that forge that is right by our friend Ray Larson's house, so where Ray lives on the Indian Head River, behind his house was the location of Barstow's Forge. And Barstow's Forge would have put their name on their feedstock that they sold, their iron pigs that they would have sold to different customers to use for whatever it is they were making. It was just an easy ID to put on there. They were essentially smelting local iron from the harvested from the bogs and other areas nearby, and pouring it into molds, which were really just an imprint and some sand. And so writing your name backwards with your finger was simple enough, and you had your iron bars labeled. Another interesting part we had about kind of rabbit hole we went down was we wanted to know a little bit more about the material that we were coming across. We knew a lot of these pieces were probably made from local iron. It was a labor-intensive process to collect all this bog iron and to cook it down to get some usable iron material out of it, but it was done, and it was economically viable. We also know that some tools, some materials needed to still come from England. We didn't have the ability to make steel in this country, even in the early 1800s, until that wasn't really developed in probably the mid-1800s or so. The pit saw was one piece that most likely had to be steel, but it could have been something that came from a local source. And what we ended up doing is we took a little sample from the saw and a little sample from this bar of iron, and we sent it to a gentleman from Yale University who's able to run an analysis on the material for us and kind of look at the impurities in it, what he saw and what he knew about the metals, and kind of tell us conclusively that they were definitely totally different places, that based on the impurities in them and whatnot, the pit saw would have come most likely from England. And this piece most likely would have come from a local source. It didn't have any reference on hand for a local source of pig iron, but now we do, which is a neat piece of this. So as we find other artifacts and want to find out if they were from a local source, we can compare them to what we know about this artifact here and get some more to the story. So next I'd like to tell a quick summary about a couple of the stories of some of the ships that were built in this area. So we've learned a lot about the different artifacts. We've dug up a lot of stories about the people that were here, and recently we've come across quite a few stories of some of the ships that were built there. And I have three that I'm going to try to get through now. And the most exciting for me is the story of the Grand Turk. So the Grand Turk was actually a ship built right at Barstow's Two Oaks during the Revolutionary War. So there was a merchant up in Salem, a man by the name of Elias Haskett Derby. And during the Revolutionary War, Mr. Derby started losing a lot of his merchant vessels to British privateers. Now, a privateer is kind of like a pirate, but they were essentially a ship that was part of a belligerent nation, privately owned, and during a time of war, the government of that nation would give them a letter of marque, essentially permission to go capture ships of their enemy and keep all the spoils for themselves. Maybe sometimes have to share some with the government, but really what the government wanted was for the privateers to deprive their belligerent nation that they were at war with, deprive them of their commerce and to really hurt their government. They're taking away their tax money, they're hurting their residents, they're taking away resources. So that was a pretty common practice and very much used during the Revolutionary War. And Mr. Derby started losing quite a few vessels to British privateers as the war was lingering on. And he decided the only way he could really deal with it, we had two options, either quit shipping, it was too risky, or to go into the privateering business himself. And he decided that's what he would do. So he outfitted a couple of his merchant vessels as privateers and started to capture some British commerce vessels, and it was pretty successful at it. Made his money back for sure, and was doing okay, but he realized his cumbersome merchant vessels that were built for carrying cargo weren't really the fastest and easiest to convert with cannons and other armament to go capture merchant vessels from the British fleet. So he had his first purpose-built privateer built at Barstow's Two Oaks. So he spent some time trying to find out who'd be the best guy to build this ship for him. And the name given to him by a couple sources was Thomas Barstow and Robert Eales. They were the kind of renowned as some of the best shipbuilders in the colonies at the time. So in 1783, he commissioned the building of this vessel, the Grand Turk, which was to be a vessel of 300 tons, the sides pierced for 28 cannons, and being manned by up to 120 men. And he had the vessel built, which was launched in 1783, and quickly went right to work, and on our first cruise managed to capture 2 British merchant vessels as prizes. That immediately made his money back from the ship. So we captured 2 ships, all the cargo on board. The crew was taken without a drop of blood being spilled, and he was doing pretty well. So we sent the vessel out again, this time under Captain Pratt, who was, not that the first cruise was at all unsuccessful, but Captain Pratt decided to be very aggressive about the idea. And I can only imagine his first day setting out to sea with this ship and having his officers on board and rolling out the charts and deciding where were they going to go to capture British merchant vessels. And their finger landed on the British Isles. Seemed like a good place to go. And so they beelined it to the British Isles and captured their first vessel right off the coast of Ireland. Within view of the coast, captured the brig Mary of about 250 tons. And it was a bloodless take. There was, once the crew of the Mary saw a ship loaded with 120 men and 14 cannons pointing at them, the last thing in the world they were expecting was an American privateer right in British waters. And so they gave up the ship. They were sent on boats to row to the coast of Ireland, and the ship was taken to Spain with a prize crew. On the Grand Turk's way to Spain to follow her prize ship, she captured 2 more vessels, and so sailed into the port of Spain, I believe it was Cadiz, with 3 prize vessels that were, the vessels were sold, the cargoes were sold. Made quite a bit of money for the captain and crew of the ship, and quite a bit of money went back to Elias Haskett Derby. Throughout the course of the war, Captain Pratt managed to capture about 14 vessels in total. And he was pretty successful with it. I think he only lost, from the book, there is a book called The Voyages of the Grand Turks, written by Robert Peabody, that describes the voyages of this vessel. And I believe only 1 man was lost on the Grand Turk during its time as a privateer, and that was a man lost overboard during a storm. So all these vessels were taken without any shots really been fired at the vessel. They'd fire a warning shot across the bow. Once a merchant vessel saw a privateer with 120 or so men and 14 cannons pointing at them, they typically gave up pretty quickly. And this was working pretty well for the Grand Turk. She had a very close brush towards the end of the war. She had just sailed out of Martinique, and a squadron of British frigates had been trying to track her down and found her. I think it was probably just a couple months left in the war at that point, but it was still raging. Now, Once the Grand Turk realized that the sails she saw on the horizon were 3 British men of war, she quickly turned tail and got out of there. But frigates are some of the fastest ships in the Navy. They're designed to be heavily gunned, but also able to catch up or get away from any ship that they see. So it was a pretty big threat to have 3 of these vessels bearing down on the Grand Turk. But she set all sail and was able to quickly outpace these 3 frigates, well-manned, well-built ships. But the Grand Turk was given quite a pat on the back, and I think after the war, the Grand Turk went on to peaceful trading. She removed her cannons and went back as a merchant vessel. She wasn't the best built for merchant trading. She was fast, but she couldn't hold quite as much cargo, and she required a bit more of a crew to operate. So she did make one trip to China and was one of the first United States vessels to establish trade directly with China. After that first cruise, she was heading back again, but she had orders from Mr. Derby to sell the vessel if a good offer came their way, and it did during the second voyage. They were actually able to sell the Grand Turk, and with the proceeds from that, were able to buy another vessel to complete their trading voyage, and still wound up with quite a profit from that transaction. After that, we don't really know what happened to the vessel. She was renamed, and the rest is lost to history. Another short story I'd like to tell was the Brig Polly, which was a vessel built in Pembroke. Most likely at the brick kiln yard. That was the most prolific shipyard in Pembroke. We know there's reference of it being built in Pembroke. It could have been the Turner's yards also that were across the river from Hanover, but that we can only speculate. The Brig Polly was a trading vessel heading east across the Atlantic in December of 1811, and she was only a couple days out from Cape Cod when she was wrecked in a storm. Now, she was carrying lumber, and that allowed her to stay afloat. So although her hull was holed, her rigging was lost, the vessel still remained above water. Now, she carried 9 people, 7 crew members and 2 passengers on this journey. The 2 passengers unfortunately perished during the wreck, but the rest of the crew survived. And the captain, being a man of significant ingenuity, figured out a way to keep the crew watered and alive. So they had a good supply of food that was fairly fresh, and they were able to live off that for a while, they knew. And they had a little bit of water, but they had to do something about it. The captain put together built a still using an iron kettle, an iron pot, and a pistol barrel as the condenser for his still. So he was able to produce fresh water. They also had the hearth still in place aboard the vessel, and a hold full of lumber. So they brought the lumber on deck, let it dry out, fed the fire, and constantly were cooking boiling water to produce a supply of fresh water for them. As their food started to run out, they were able to fashion some fish hooks out of other pieces of metal and catch fish. And by this way, they survived. But they did start to lose some of their crew. So the 7 people that survived the initial wreck did start to pass one by one until about 6 months into this perilous journey. 2 people survived. It was the captain and we believe the cook of that vessel. They were rescued off the coast of Africa 6 months after she was wrecked. And this was quite a story. Even in a day of wooden ships and constant shipwrecks, to have a ship be lost at sea for 6 months and then turn up with 2 of the crew members alive was quite a story. It made the local papers and was talked about quite a bit at the time. Another in her writings, got another kind of plug for the quality of shipbuilding on the North River. A vessel that was wrecked and adrift at sea for 6 months still held together enough to maintain some level of survival for the remaining crew members. And the last story I'm going to tell, I'll try to get through this one. I don't want to keep this going too long, but the whale ship Owino was a whaler built in the year 1821 at Barstow's Lower Yard, which was just downriver from the Barstow's Two Oaks Yard. Now, she was built for a whale out of Nantucket, and in the year 1825 was whaling in the Pacific off the in the South China Sea, and was off the island of Fiji, where she wrecked in a storm in the Fiji island chain. Now, the ship washed ashore, it was grounded, it was broken up, but the crew all survived and was able to get off safely. They met some friendly natives on shore who took them in, and were doing okay until a group of not-so-friendly natives from a neighboring island came over and slaughtered them except for one man, a man named William Carey. Now, William Carey had kind of some premonition of danger. I think he saw this group, and just for some reason, they looked dangerous to him. Even it was just another group of natives. People had been helping them out. He hid in a cave, saw and heard his crewmen being slaughtered. There were 21 of them originally, so 20 of them were killed, and he was the sole survivor. He found a friendly family to stay with. The people there were actually mostly very welcoming. A white person of European descent was seen as kind of an object of value. There were traders that coming through these islands quite often, and they would often trade knives and muskets and other metal trinkets that were highly valued, but without someone knowing how to properly take care of a musket, it was pretty useless after a few months. So having someone that knew how to use this was quite valuable. Also someone who could speak the language of the people that were coming by trading. It was great to befriend that person and teach them the local language, and that's exactly what Mr. Carey did. So he lived with the natives for quite a while. Not too long into his stay, he met his first other white man who was also living among the islanders, and he thought, this is great. He saw this guy coming over in a canoe and ran out. He couldn't believe his good fortune that a person that he can speak the same language came his way. And when he goes and starts talking to this man, the man asks him, do you know David Whippy of Nantucket? And the man goes, oh yeah, I do. He's a childhood friend of mine. And then the man said, I'm David Whippy of Nantucket. And so the man that he met on an island a half a world away was a childhood friend, which sounds totally unbelievable. I was reading this story. I think this is one of the times I was probably nudging my wife awake while I was reading this book to tell her what happened in this story. Thinking about it more, I was like, well, Nantucketers were going all over the world, so I can see how it wasn't too far-fetched, but still quite an amazing part of the story. Mr. Carey did end up spending quite a few years there and quite a few adventures, so he established himself with one of the local kings of the different chiefdoms. And his friend David Whippy actually became a chief himself, and these were very prominent people in the local society. They were involved in the local trade. There was a peculiar sponge that was very popular in China, so the tea ships that were coming across the Pacific and head up to China would stop here to get a cargo of this peculiar sponge. It was Bermeck but I'm probably not really pronouncing it correctly. But anyway, this was kind of the commodity. A lot of traders would come by to trade this sponge for tea and then sail back to the States. So he established himself as kind of an intermediary. He was a middleman with some of the merchants who were coming through, and saw quite a few ships coming through. And he was pretty well established and having a good time at this point. He'd really set out on his voyage to make his fortunes, to whale, to do something. And right now he was penniless and just kind of getting by, but he realized if he kept this up for a while, he would actually be able to do okay. So he stayed on the island, despite ships coming back that could have eventually got him back to the States. There's also a little bit of complication. A lot of the ships were heading to China because they would stop on China, stop in the Fiji island chain, then to China, then back home. So it would be a long roundabout route to get home. And he would also not necessarily get a free ride. He had to be of value to a crew, so he had to be able to sign on as an able-bodied seaman, which he was. But if he had to kind of wait for a ship to come by that really needed him. Eventually he did. In 1831, after several adventures of battles and voyages throughout the islands, he did grab a schooner or a ship named the Glide, and that was on its way back to Nantucket. And he talked to some of the crew. He'd known quite a few traders who were coming through there on a regular basis anyhow. So he got the lay of the land, and he landed a berth on the ship, the Glide, that went trading around the islands, and just before she was about to head back to Nantucket, was wrecked in another storm about 2 islands away from the one he was originally wrecked on. So Mr. Carey was kind of right back where he started, with a whole crew of people in the same boat, quite literally as him. The ship Glide was a loss. The crew all survived that wreck as well. And we're now, I had a whole crew of guys that were looking for a way home. Shortly after, a schooner named the Pern came by that was on its way back to Salem. Mr. Carey was able to sign papers and get a berth on the Pern, and did make his way back to Salem and then back to Nantucket in 1833. He had originally wrecked in 1825, so he spent almost 8 years in the Fiji island chain and was away from home for about 9 years. During his time, he was actually able to send letters back home and receive letters. So he wasn't a total mystery for him to just show up one day, but it was quite a story, and it was received with quite a welcome when he got home. He did write up all his adventures, and it was published at the time in a local newspaper in Nantucket, and then later compiled into a book called Wrecked on Fijis, which I've been lucky enough to get a copy of, and it's an easy read and quite a wonderful story. So those are just a little taste of some of the stories that we've been digging up about ships built in the North River. We are compiling more and more, and like I mentioned earlier, there are a group of us who are getting together, and as kind of a celebration of the 100th year anniversary of the historical shipyard markers that are along the North River. We'll be producing more of these stories and putting these together. This fall, we're expecting to do a series of lectures, most likely around the different historical societies in the North River communities. So if you like this story, you can keep your feelers out for more coming from the local communities along the North River. I guess last, I'd like to say there are quite a few excellent resources too. A lot of you are probably aware of some of the books and the local historical societies. I don't know if any of you have been to the Maritime and Mossy Museum in Scituate, but that's a wonderful trip as well. History of Shipbuilding on the North River by L. Vernon Briggs is not so much written as a story. It has a lot of genealogy, it has a lot of facts, but it also does have some good stories in it as well. The Voyage of the Grand Turks, Wrecked on Fijis, and another book where we got the story of the Polly Brig called Lost and Lonely Ships is quite Lost and Lonely Seas is quite an excellent read as well. Of course, the different historical books of Hanover by Robert Barry, Dean's History of Scituate. All these have the little tidbits that we've been kind of putting these stories together, but some of these books just offer an excellent read on their own. So that's all I have for tonight. If anyone had any questions they wanted to ask or wanted to come up and check the artifacts, please do. We'd love to share more information. Thank you.
I just thought he was fascinating. I mean, he's very knowledgeable about the shipbuilding industry. You know, I do a lot of paddling, and I enjoy paddling, and I've seen the shipbuilding sites along the North River, and he just has a lot of information about it, and I just really enjoyed it. I mean, I had a good time tonight. I'd come back to all the North and South River and Audubon programs. He's just terrific.
There was a great turnout, and usually for me the best indicator I find is when I have the questions at the end, and there was a lot of really great engaging questions. I think most people enjoyed it. I got some good feedback at the end.